The gavel fell with the sound of a breaking bone. In the silence of the Promise Creek meeting hall, the noise was obscene. Ilara stood alone before the town council, a slip of a girl at 19, with her father's honest eyes and hands already calloused from work he had taught her. Mayor Thorne, a man whose softness was a kind of weapon, did not look at her as he read the verdict from a piece of paper. His voice was oiled with false regret. Due to outstanding debts and liens against the estate of the late Mason Croft, he announced to the dusty air, the council hereby reclaims the property and associated workshop at No. 7 Mill Road. The assets will be liquidated to satisfy the town's claims. A murmur went through the small crowd of onlookers. It was an injustice, and they all knew it. Mason Croft had built half the town with his own 2 hands, his stone foundation so true that they would outlast the mountains. But he had been a quiet man, one who bartered more than he billed, and Thorne had used that quietness, twisting it into a narrative of debt and neglect. Ilara did not cry. She had done her crying in the nights after her father's heart had given out. Now a cold, hard thing was settling in her chest, something heavier than grief. It was resolve. Thorne slid a small leather purse across the table, the coins inside making a pathetic clink. "The council is not without mercy," he said, his eyes still fixed on his papers. "This should be sufficient for passage to the city. There are opportunities there for a young woman." He meant a scullery or a laundry or some other life of quiet servitude. He pushed a second document toward her. It was a deed, the paper brittle and yellowed. "Your father also held the title to this, the old Thorne Quarry. It is, of course, worthless, but the title is his, and now yours. The law is the law." A few men in the back snickered. The Thorne Quarry was a local joke, a collapsed pit of unstable limestone that Thorne's own grandfather had sold to Ilara's father for $1, laughing about it for years. Ilara looked at the purse, then at the deed. She had $7. She had the clothes on her back. And she had Cinder, her father's massive, shaggy dog, who waited for her on the steps outside, his tail not having wagged since the day Mason died. She took the purse and the deed. She did not say, "Thank you." Mr. Gable, the owner of the town mercantile, stopped her on her way out. He was a practical man, not cruel, but a firm believer in the world as it was, not as it should be. "Listen, Ilara," he said, his voice low. "Thorne is a snake. We all know it. But don't be a fool. That quarry is a grave. Take the money, buy a ticket east. Don't let pride be the thing that kills you." She looked at him, her gaze so steady it made him uncomfortable. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Gable," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not the voice of a victim. She walked out of the hall and into the biting autumn air. Cinder rose to his feet, pressing his great head into her hand. She did not walk toward the coach station. She walked toward the mercantile. Inside, she laid her $7 on the counter. "I need a good felling axe," she said, "the best one you have, and a shovel head, a coil of your strongest rope, and a sack of salt." Gable stared at the coins, then at her. He saw the foolishness of it, the sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was throwing her life away, but something in her eyes, a reflection of the same unyielding granite her father used to build with, stopped him. He sold her the tools. It felt, to him, like selling a coffin to a ghost. With the axe handle over her shoulder and the heavy supplies in a sack on her back, Ilara turned her face to the west, away from the town. She walked toward the jagged hills where the worthless land awaited. Cinder trotted beside her, a silent, loyal shadow. The town of Promise Creek, the only home she had ever known, was now behind her. They had taken everything. They thought she was finished. Ilara planned only to begin. The journey was only 3 miles, but each step was an act of rebellion. The path climbed out of the relative shelter of the valley and onto the wind-scoured shoulder of the mountain. The trees grew sparse, replaced by stubborn, low-lying scrub and fields of stone. The weight of the sack cut into her shoulders, and the axe handle, smooth and new, felt alien in her hand. Cinder stayed close, his body a warm presence against her leg, sensing the shift in their world. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold stone, and the farther she walked, the more the sounds of the town, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant rumble of a wagon, faded into the sighing of the wind. She arrived at the quarry as the sun began to dip below the far peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. And her heart sank. It was worse than she remembered. It was a wound in the earth, a great gaping scar of gray rock and shadow. One side was a sheer cliff face of fractured limestone 50 feet high. The other side was a steep slope of scree and rubble that tumbled down into a dark central pit. The bottom was a mess of shattered boulders and pools of black, stagnant water. It was a place of ruin, a place where things ended. For a moment she stood on the precipice, the wind tearing at her hair, and she allowed despair to wash over her. It was a cold, numbing tide. Mr. Gable was right. The town was right. This was a grave. What had she been thinking? What mad hope had propelled her up this hill? Her knees felt weak, and the sting in her eyes was not from the wind. Cinder whined softly, nudging her hand with his wet nose as if to say, "Not here, not. Let's not stay here." She sank to her knees, the weight of the sack pushing her down, and she stared into the abyss her father had left her. But as she knelt there, shivering, she noticed something strange. The wind howled over the rim of the quarry, a physical, shrieking force that bent the tough little bushes flat against the ground. Yet, down in the pit, the surface of the black water was perfectly still. Not a ripple. The tall, dead weeds growing between the rocks did not stir. The air down there was calm. Curiosity, a stronger force than despair, took hold. She uncoiled her new rope, tied one end securely around the base of a stunted but solid pine, and lowered herself carefully down the scree slope. As she descended below the rim, the roar of the wind vanished, replaced by an almost unnatural quiet. The air grew still and, she realized, warmer. Not warm, but less cold. The biting edge of the wind was gone. At the bottom she stood among the rubble. The silence was profound. She ran her hand along the base of the cliff face. The stone was cold, damp. She worked her way along it, Cinder following, his claws clicking on the loose rock. Then she found it. Hidden behind a fall of larger boulders was a dark opening, a fissure in the rock no taller than she was, and perhaps half as wide. It looked like just another crack in the fractured cliff, but as she drew closer, she felt it. A faint, steady current of air breathed from the opening. It was not a draft. It was a slow, constant exhalation, and it was warm, a deep, subterranean warmth, like the breath of the slumbering earth. She placed her palm against the rock beside the fissure, and it was cool, but the air flowing past her skin was undeniably, miraculously warmer than the autumn day. A geothermal vent. Her father had talked about them, about the deep heat of the world. He had bought this land for a reason. Hope, fierce and sudden, surged through her like a fire. She began pulling away the smaller rocks from the entrance, her bare hands scraping against the sharp edges. Behind the first layer of rubble, the fissure opened up, and then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Drip, drip, drip. Peering into the darkness, she saw a gleam of moisture on the rock. A slow, steady seep of water, clear as glass, was emerging from a crack deep within the fissure and trickling down the stone into a small, clean pool on the cave floor. Constant warmth, clean water, shelter from the wind. This wasn't a worthless hole. It wasn't a grave. It was a foundation. The town was wrong. Her father was not a fool. He had given her not a ruin, but a chance. Elara stood up, her hands bleeding, her face smeared with dirt. She looked into the dark, warm promise of the rock, and for the first time in weeks she smiled. She had work to do. The first week was a blur of brutal, relentless labor. Her world shrank to the quarry pit, to the ache in her back and the fire in her hands. The first task was to clear the entrance to the fissure. She used the shovel to move the smaller scree and the flat end of the axe to pry at the larger, wedged-in stones. Some were too big to move. For those, she used the lessons her father had taught her about leverage and balance, using smaller rocks as fulcrums to shift the massive ones, inch by agonizing inch. Her hands, soft from a life of keeping house, blistered on the second day. By the fourth, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin that stuck to the axe handle. She tore strips from her spare petticoat and wrapped them tightly, gritting her teeth against the pain. Once the entrance was clear, she could see the true shape of her inheritance. The fissure opened into a natural cavern, not large, perhaps 20 feet deep and a dozen feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. The floor was uneven rock, but it was dry. The warmth from the vent kept the air from feeling stagnant, and the slow drip of the spring was a constant, reassuring presence. This would be the heart of her home. The next task was to build a wall. The open front of the cavern was exposed to the quarry pit. She needed to enclose it, to turn the cave into a room. She began hauling stones from the rubble field at the bottom of the quarry. She chose the flattest ones she could find, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Look for the grain of the stone, Ilara. See how it wants to lie." She stacked them one by one, building a low wall first, then raising it higher. The work was slow and punishing. Each stone was heavy, awkward. Her muscles screamed in protest. Some days she would only manage to lay a single course of stones before exhaustion claimed her, and she would collapse onto her bed of pine boughs, cinder curled beside her for warmth, her body aching so deeply it felt like a sickness. For mortar, she used the land itself. She found a deposit of clay at the bottom of one of the stagnant pools. She dug it out, bucket by bucket, and hauled it up to her building site. She mixed it with water from the spring and sand she painstakingly sifted from the quarry floor. It wasn't proper lime mortar, but it was thick and sticky, and it would fill the gaps. Sealing her home against the wind, she could still hear raging above the quarry rim. Slowly, agonizingly, the wall rose. She left a gap for a door, and a smaller one, high up, for a window. She felled a few of the tough, stringy pines that grew on the slopes, teaching herself the rhythm of the axe, feeling the bite of the steel into the wood. Stripping the branches and hauling the logs down into the pit was a monumental effort. She laid them across the top of her stone wall and the lip of the cave entrance, creating a crude but solid roof for the front portion of her shelter. Over this, she layered pine boughs, then packed the whole thing with a thick layer of her clay and sand mortar. It was ugly, but it would be strong. While the wall was her main focus, she worked on her other systems in the moments between. She used her shovel to carve a shallow channel in the stone floor of the cave, guiding the water from the spring away from her living space and toward a natural depression near the entrance. Over several days, she lined this depression with a thick layer of clay, packing it down until it was smooth and watertight. She had built a cistern. No more scrambling to the spring with a cup. She had a reservoir of clean, fresh water inside her home. The geothermal vent was a miracle, but it wasn't enough to fight off the deep cold of the coming winter. She needed fire. Against the deepest interior wall of the cavern, she began to build a fireplace. This was her father's art, and she summoned every memory, every lesson. She chose the stones with immense care, fitting them together so tightly they barely needed mortar. She built a deep firebox and a high, wide hearth. For the chimney, she used another of the quarry's secrets. High above the spot she had chosen, a thin, vertical fissure snaked its way up through the rock face. It was a natural flue. By building her fireplace directly beneath it, she could channel the smoke safely out of the cave, where it would dissipate invisibly high on the cliff face. The stone around the fireplace was feet thick, a massive thermal battery that would soak up the heat from the fire and radiate it back into the room long after the flames died down. After a month of labor, the shelter was habitable. The wall was complete, the roof was sealed, and the fireplace stood ready. She fashioned a door from leftover pine logs and scraps of her rope, a heavy, crude thing that swung on leather hinges she cut from her own boots. The first night she lit a fire, the feeling was one of triumph so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The smoke drew perfectly up the natural chimney. The stone hearth began to warm. The golden light pushed back the ancient darkness of the cave. She sat on the floor, leaning against cinder, her raw hands throbbing, and watched the flames dance. She was not in a hole, she was home. But a home was not enough. She needed food. The next morning she banked the fire and began the long walk back to Promise Creek. Her appearance caused a stir. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt and clay. Her face was thin, her hands were a mess of healing cuts and thick calluses, but her eyes held a new, unshakable confidence. People stared. They had assumed she was gone or dead. She walked into Gable's Mercantile. The store owner looked up and his jaw dropped. "Alara? By God, girl, you're alive." "I am," she said simply. "I need supplies." She bought 3 laying hens, a small nervous goat, and packets of seeds, carrots, turnips, kale. The other customers in the store whispered. Mr. Brandt, a local trapper known for his loud opinions, laughed out loud. "What are you going to do with chickens, Quarry Girl? Teach 'em to roost on rocks?" The nickname stung, but she ignored him. She paid Gable with the last of her coins, leaving herself with nothing. As she was leaving, leading her tiny, bewildered flock, she saw Mayor Thorne across the street. He watched her for a long moment, a look of profound pity on his face, then shook his head and turned away. His expression said everything, the poor, foolish girl, still clinging to her hopeless fantasy. The journey back was even harder, coaxing the stubborn goat and carrying the crate of chickens. But when she finally descended into the quiet of her quarry, she felt only relief. She built a small, secure pen for the animals at the far back of the cavern, where the geothermal warmth was most constant. They settled in quickly, their soft noises adding a new layer of life to her solitary world. The final piece of her system was the garden. Using the empty supply sacks, she began the arduous task of hauling topsoil from the woods above the quarry down into her cave. She built raised beds against the wall opposite the fireplace, filling them with the rich, dark earth. She planted her seeds in neat rows. It was a mad idea, a garden in a cave. But she had a theory: the constant, moderate temperature from the vent, the warmth from the stone hearth, and the light from the single, carefully placed window might just be enough. It was a gamble for her very survival, planted in the dark. The people of Promise Creek did not forget about Ilara. She became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to stubborn children. The name Quarry Girl stuck. They spoke of Thorne's folly with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Mr. Brandt, the trapper, made it a point to check his lines near the quarry, and he would report back to the men at the Mercantile with mocking updates. "Saw smoke coming out of a crack in the rock," he'd guffaw. "Like a dragon's lair. That girl's gone wild as a badger." One afternoon, Brandt himself appeared at the rim of the quarry. He stood there, silhouetted against the gray sky, and stared down at her work. Ilara was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of her axe echoing in the stone pit. She stopped and looked up at him, her face impassive. "You're a fool, girl," he shouted down, his voice laced with condescending certainty. "That little wall of yours will crumble in the first freeze. The snows will fill this pit and you'll be buried alive. You won't last till midwinter." Ilara simply picked up her axe and went back to her work. She didn't have the energy for his kind of foolishness. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any argument. He spat on the ground and stalked off, and the story of the silent, mad quarry girl grew even more colorful in the telling. As autumn deepened into winter, the first snows began to fall. Ilara's world shrank, becoming a small, ordered universe of stone and warmth. The rhythm of her days was dictated by survival. She woke before dawn, the cave lit by the soft glow of banked embers in the fireplace. Her first task was always the fire, adding logs from the massive stack she had accumulated, a wall of firewood that reached the ceiling and represented months of backbreaking labor. Then came the animals. She milked the goat, its warm flank a comfort in the chill air. She collected the eggs from the hens, each one a small, perfect miracle. The sounds of her small flock, the soft clucking, the goat's occasional bleat, were her only conversation. She talked to them sometimes, her voice rough from disuse. Her garden was the greatest marvel. Against all odds, the seeds had sprouted. Tiny green shoots pushed up from the dark soil. The combination of the stable, geothermally warmed air and the radiant heat from the fireplace created a bizarre microclimate. The plants grew slowly, but they grew. Tending to them was a ritual. She watered them carefully from her cistern, her fingers tracing the delicate leaves. In a world that was turning white and barren, she had a secret patch of green life. Her days were filled with the quiet, relentless tasks of maintenance. She checked the chinking in her wall for drafts, patching it with fresh clay. She cleared snow away from her door and window. She set snares in the woods above the quarry, occasionally catching a rabbit to add to her stew pot. She mended her worn clothes by the firelight, her fingers growing nimble with the needle. The isolation was profound. Weeks would go by without her seeing another human soul. Some days the silence was a heavy blanket. Other days it was a peaceful gift. Cinder was her constant companion. He slept at the foot of her cot, a warm, breathing weight in the darkness. When the loneliness felt sharpest, she would bury her face in his thick fur and feel the steady beat of his heart. He was her guardian, her family, her anchor to the world. Before the great blizzard, smaller tests came, as if the mountain were probing her defenses. A sudden thaw followed by a snap freeze coated her outer wall in a thick sheet of ice, and she spent a day chipping it away, worried the weight would compromise her mortar. A pack of wolves, driven down from the high country by hunger, found their way into the quarry one night. Their howls echoed off the stone walls, a terrifying chorus. But Cinder stood before the door, his hackles raised, a deep rumbling growl in his chest that promised violence. The heavy door and the solid walls held, and the wolves, unable to find purchase on the steep cliff face, eventually moved on. Each small victory was a confirmation. Her systems worked. She was not just surviving, she was secure. She was ready. It began not as snow, but as a change in the color of the light. A strange, bruised yellow filtered through the gray sky. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell utterly silent. The world held its breath. Ilara, standing at the entrance to her shelter, felt a prickle of unease. Cinder stood beside her, whining low in his throat, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon. The blizzard of '83 did not arrive. It descended. The first flakes were small and hard, like grains of sand. Within an hour, the air was a blinding, churning torrent of white. The wind returned with a vengeance, not as a moan, but as a physical scream. It hit the top of the quarry like a hammer, a solid wall of force that ripped branches from the pines and sent them cartwheeling into the abyss. The temperature plummeted. It was a cold that felt ancient and malevolent, a cold that sought out every crack, every weakness, a cold that wanted to extinguish all warmth. Down in Promise Creek, the community's confidence shattered in a matter of hours. Their well-built, conventional homes were no match for the storm's fury. The wind found its way under the eaves of Mr. Gable's house, peeling back the shingles one by one. The roof of the meeting hall, Mayor Thorne's pride and joy, groaned under the impossible weight of the snow, and then, with a sound like a gunshot, a main beam cracked. Chimneys, built to face the prevailing winds, were now assaulted from all directions. Icy snow was driven down the flues, choking the fires and filling rooms with blinding, acrid smoke. Firewood, stacked neatly in sheds and against the sunny sides of houses, became inaccessible, buried under mountainous drifts. Families huddled together in a single room, feeding their dwindling fires with furniture. The town's livestock, safe in their sturdy barns, began to die. The cold was too absolute. It seeped through the thickest wooden walls and stole the life from them as they stood. The town of Promise Creek, so sure of its methods and its mastery over the land, was freezing to death in the dark. In Ilara's stone shelter, it was another world. The wind shrieked and howled, but it was a distant thing, a battle happening far overhead. Down in the quarry pit the air was still. Her thick stone walls, anchored to the mountain itself, did not tremble. The massive weight of snow that fell into the pit only served to insulate her further, burying her small home in a thick, soundproof blanket of white. Inside, the fire in her great stone hearth burned hot and steady. She had enough firewood stacked inside the cavern to last a month. The thermal mass of the fireplace and the surrounding rock soaked up the heat, radiating it back as a deep, penetrating warmth that filled the entire space. The geothermal vent did its quiet work, keeping the stone floor from ever truly freezing. Her animals were calm. The goat chewed its cud placidly, and the chickens slept, tucked together in their pen. Her small garden was an impossible splash of green against the gray stone, untouched by the white fury raging outside. The water in her cistern was cool and clear. She was not fighting the storm. She was beyond its reach, living and breathing in a pocket of warmth and life she had carved from the heart of the indifferent stone. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in her life she felt completely, unshakably safe. On the third day of the blizzard the sound came. It was faint at first, nearly lost in the muffled quiet of her buried shelter. But Cinder heard it. His head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ilara put a hand on his back to quiet him and listened. There it was again, a frantic, desperate banging on her heavy wooden door. No one came to the quarry, no one. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Who could possibly be out in this? She drew the thick wooden bar that secured the door and pulled it inward. A figure, completely encrusted in snow and ice, stumbled in and collapsed onto the stone floor. It was a man. As she rolled him over, she saw his face, blue with cold and rimmed with ice. It was Mr. Gable. He was barely coherent, his words broken by violent shivers. "Help! Please! My Lily!" He gasped for air, his lungs rattling. "Fever! The house! So cold! Chimneys blocked! Smoke!" He dissolved into a fit of coughing that shook his entire body. Ilara's mind raced. Mr. Gable, the man who had told her to give up, whose wife had looked at her with such pity, the man who represented the town that had cast her out. She looked at her stores, the neat stacks of firewood, the shelves of preserved vegetables, the flour bin. She had enough for herself, enough to last the rest of the winter if she was careful. Taking in others would strain her resources to the breaking point. It was a risk, a terrible risk. She looked down at the man shivering on her floor, his face a mask of desperation. She saw not the condescending store owner, but a father terrified for his child. And in that moment, there was no choice. Not really. Her father had taught her to build things that last, but he had also taught her that a person's character was the only structure that truly mattered. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "We'll bring them here." The rescue was a nightmare. She wrapped Mr. Gable in blankets and forced hot broth down his throat until he stopped shaking uncontrollably. Then she prepared for the journey. She loaded a small, crude sled she had built with more blankets, a hot brick from the hearth, wrapped in thick cloth, and a lantern. She strapped a small pouch of dried meat and hard biscuits to her own belt. "Cinder will guide you," she told Gable, her voice sharp with command. "Do not lose sight of him. I will be right behind." She opened the door to a wall of white. The world outside was an alien landscape, all familiar shapes erased by the storm. The snow in the quarry pit was waist-deep. Getting out onto the path was the first great struggle. But Cinder, a powerful beast bred for harsh country, plunged ahead, his body creating a narrow channel through the drifts. Ilara and Gable followed, fighting for every step. The wind on the path was a physical assault. It stole their breath and burned their exposed skin. Ilara pulled her scarf up over her face, leaving only a narrow slit for her eyes. She focused on the dark shape of the dog ahead of them, a phantom moving through the white chaos. Several times Gable fell, his strength failing. Each time she hauled him back to his feet, her own muscles screaming in protest. It was not a journey of miles, it was a journey of inches, each one bought with pain and willpower. When they finally reached the town, it was like a ghost settlement. Houses were dark, half-buried mounds. They found Gable's home filled with a haze of cold smoke. His wife, Martha, was huddled in a corner with their daughter, Lily, who was wrapped in every blanket they owned. The child was pale, her breathing shallow and rapid. There was no time for explanations. Ilara took charge. She wrapped the sick child in the pre-warmed blankets, lifted her into her own arms, and led the small, desperate party back out into the storm, following the path Cinder had already broken. The journey back was a slow, agonizing retreat from the edge of death. When the four of them finally stumbled back through the door of the quarry shelter, the warmth hit them like a solid thing. Martha Gable stopped dead, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Gable, seeing the place now with clear eyes, simply stared. He had imagined a damp, miserable hole. He saw a home. The fire in the massive stone hearth blazed, casting a warm, golden light over the entire cavern. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. In the back, a goat looked up at them curiously, and chickens shifted in their pen. And against the far wall, under the soft light from the high window, was the impossible sight, a garden, green and alive. Rows of kale and turnip tops stood in defiance of the frozen world outside. A cistern of clear water reflected the firelight. The walls were lined with shelves, neatly organized with jars of preserved berries, sacks of grain, and tools. This was not the hovel of a mad girl. This was a fortress. It was a work of genius. Ilara paid their shock no mind. She gently laid the sick child on her own cot near the fire, checking her fever with a practiced hand. "Martha," she said, her voice calm and steady, "there is stew on the fire. You and your husband must eat. You need your strength." Before long, others came. Gable, revived by the food and warmth, had gone back out, a lifeline of hope in the dying town. He returned with the trapper, Brant, who was half frozen and supporting his own young son. Brant, the man who had mocked her loudest, stumbled into the warmth, and his jaw went slack. His eyes darted around the cavern, taking in the impossible reality of it all. He looked from the garden to the animals, from the cistern to the towering wood pile. He was followed by more, a family of 4 whose roof had collapsed, 2 old men whose fire had died, and finally Mayor Thorne himself, his face gray with cold and defeat, his wife and 2 children shivering beside him. He, the man who had cast her out and declared her inheritance worthless, now stood at her door, a beggar seeking sanctuary. He looked around the shelter, at the dozen or so souls now huddled within its warmth. He saw the ingenious systems, the foresight, the sheer indomitable will that had built this place. He looked at Ilara, who was quietly spooning broth into Lily Gable's mouth. She was no longer the quarry girl. She was their savior. Thorne's pride, a thing as cold and hard as the winter outside, finally broke. He stepped forward, his voice cracking with emotion and shame. "We were wrong," he said, his words loud in the suddenly quiet cavern. "My God, Ilara, We called you a fool. We were the fools. Every eye turned to Alara. This was her moment of triumph, her chance for vengeance. She could have shamed them, reminded them of their mockery, of their injustice. Instead, she simply looked up from the sick child and met the mayor's gaze. Her expression was not one of triumph, but of a deep, weary calm. She gave no speech. She offered no absolution. Her grace was simpler and far more powerful. She gestured with her spoon toward the bubbling pot on the hearth. "There is food," she said. "Eat." She then turned to his wife. "Bring your children closer to the fire. It is the warmest place." In that simple, practical act of kindness, her victory was absolute. It was not the victory of being right, but the victory of character. She did not need their apologies. She needed only to be who she was, a builder, a survivor, a provider. She offered them shelter not because of who they were, but because of who she was. The town that had left her with nothing now depended on her for everything. The great blizzard raged for 2 more days. Inside the stone shelter, a strange community formed. Under Ilara's quiet direction, they fell into a routine. The men helped haul firewood from the stack. The women helped cook and tend to the sick. They shared the food she had so carefully stored, their shame a palpable thing in the warm air. Ilara moved among them, a figure of calm authority, her knowledge of her own systems absolute. She showed them how to bank the fire to conserve wood, how to draw water from the cistern without waste, how to harvest the tough outer leaves of the kale from her garden. When the storm finally broke, the world it revealed was terrifying and beautiful. The sun shone on a landscape transformed, buried under a dozen feet of pure white snow. From the rim of the quarry, the town of Promise Creek was almost invisible, only the tops of a few roofs and the church steeple poking through the drifts. It was a scene of utter devastation. But the 15 souls who had sheltered in Ilara's hold were alive. As they emerged blinking into the bright, cold sunlight, the town's hierarchy had been irrevocably shattered. Mayor Thorne was no longer the leader. He was just a man who had been saved. Brant the trapper, the voice of rugged self-reliance, was just a father grateful his son was warm. They looked at Ilara not as the outcast, but as the one who had seen the truth they had all missed. The nickname Thorne's Folly was buried forever under the snows of '83. In its place, people began to speak of the Stone Hearth. Some called it Ilara's Hold. The story of her survival and their rescue became the defining legend of Promise Creek. In the weeks of recovery that followed, the community's relationship with Ilara was transformed. Mayor Thorne, in a public town meeting, formally apologized and offered to return her father's house and workshop. Ilara, standing in the back of the crowd, politely refused. "The quarry is my home now," she said, and no one questioned it. Her simple statement was understood by all. She had built her life on the bedrock they had discarded, and it was now more valuable than any property in the valley. Her methods began to change the way people lived. Men would make the trek to the quarry, not with mockery, but with humble questions. They asked about building with stone, about thermal mass, about siting a home to be sheltered from the wind. New barns were built dug into the sides of hills. New homes were constructed with massive stone fireplaces at their core. The town, having learned its lesson in the harshest way possible, began to adapt, building with resilience instead of just pride. The Stone Hearth became a landmark, a testament to what one person's vision and relentless effort could achieve. Years passed. Ilara remained at the quarry. She never married, but she was never truly alone. The children she had saved, now grown with families of their own, were constant visitors. She became the town's quiet conscience, its resident wise woman. People came to her not just for advice on building, but for her steady, grounded perspective on life. She traded her surplus vegetables, eggs, and goat cheese for the things she needed from town, a respected and integral part of the community that had once thrown her away. One late summer evening, Ilara, now a woman with threads of silver in her hair, stood at the edge of her quarry. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and the chirping of crickets. Below, the lights of Promise Creek twinkled on, a town rebuilt, stronger and wiser than before. She looked down at her home, the solid stone wall now covered in moss, the roof patched and secure, a thin curl of smoke rising from the hidden chimney. Cinder's descendant, another great shaggy dog, lay at her feet. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a legacy, not of stone and mortar, but of resilience. She had learned that true worth is not found in what others value, but in the potential one has the courage to see and the strength one has to build. The world had given her a worthless hole in the ground, and she had found in its depths everything that mattered.